Um, it's kind of a gloomy evening out there, but at least I think it's supposed to warm up, so that'll be nice tomorrow. Do we have any, before we start our study tonight, do we have any prayer requests or updates on prayer requests? I'm looking at the prayer list here. Okay, so we're going to continue our study about the mission of God's people this evening. I wasn't here last week, but we were on a little mini vacation. Went over to Asheville and went around the the little chateau over there that they've got in the hills, the Biltmore. So that was interesting. That was interesting. I kept thinking as I was walking around through there, is like, I wonder, when Jesus talks about having a mansion prepared, I wonder if we get to heaven, it's going to be like, okay, here's your mansion. But then I thought, boy, that's a lot of house to clean. I don't know that I'd want to stay there. But it was a good trip. But I did watch what Danny talked about last week about his talking about mission of God's people as seen in the Exodus, if you recall, and how God worked through that and what that means as far as us as God's people. And as he indicated, we're studying now how God's grace and his faithfulness in the return of Israel from exile, what that shows us about God and about his people, and how that applies to us, how we can draw lessons from that to further understand why we're here. What does God intend for us? What should we be about? And what's in store for us as well. So I hope we can draw some lessons from that this evening. We're going to be looking a lot at Isaiah, who prophesied a lot about the exile, and particularly in the last part of the Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, and the message there. We're going to be taking some verses from there. But the exile we'll focus on first. I just put this picture up here. This is somebody's artist's rendering of what the exile, how it began. Of course, this is depicting the fall of Jerusalem. And I think this is meant to be, there was more than one time that the Babylonians went into Jerusalem, but I think this is about 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed the temple, and really that was the pivotal moment when God's judgment was revealed against the people of Judah for their idolatry and faithlessness. So this was God working through Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to bring his judgment about. And you can see through this picture, well, I put it up there, one artist's idea about what it would have been like, but I think it gives an idea about how horrible this event was in so many ways. We today don't really understand a lot of, we have no concept, maybe from World War II when you see some of the video or watch some of those history shows like I do, and you see some footage from World War II when cities were just sacked, and the pictures of people being carted off to the concentration camps and the Holocaust. It's horrible, absolutely horrible. But a lot of that was going on back then too, even more horrible, inhumane acts that are lost to history, but just terrible, terrible events. I did see that actually when I was in Poland, where, of course, that country during World War II was just devastated. And going around in Warsaw, they have this big palace, like the royal palace there in Poland in Warsaw, that you can go and tour. I didn't realize this till like the second or third time I'd been there and toured around, because we liked to go there when we could, as the soldiers did. But all that's a recreation. Since World War II, they rebuilt it. I mean, it had been there hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years or more. And then in World War II, it was just devastated, wiped out. And they tried to rebuild it just as it was. But it took me a while to realize that wow, this is all new, because it was completely devastated. Well, that's what happened to Jerusalem. And this marks kind of the beginning of the exile, which is going to be central to our thoughts tonight. Because God didn't stop there with the destruction of Jerusalem and rendering his judgment on the people of Judah. He still had a plan. Still had a plan in mind. and he was faithful to the promises that he had made to the patriarchs, mainly we're talking about Abraham and Moses. Those promises God still intended to keep, even through all of this. He hadn't abandoned them. They may have felt like they were abandoned, but he hadn't abandoned them. And I think we can draw lessons from that. So that's what we're going to look at. So, mission of God's people, of course, bring good news. So, is one of our primary missions. When we talk about missions of God people, bring good news, the gospel, the good news, to a world where, of course, bad news is, and this kind of destruction and everything is all too common. Bad news is everywhere. It travels far faster than good news. But that is part of our mission, is to bring a little light to this world that has such darkness, and to bring the good news. And as he shares in our study that we've been drawing on, it's the one I'm looking at is Christopher Wright's Mission of God's People. Excuse me. And in a lot of his book, he talks about we share that good news, that gospel, in all kind of different ways. It's not just by word of mouth, by teaching somebody. That's important. That's important to be ready and able and willing to share in words and study. But you share it in different ways. We as God's people will share it in our actions, in the way we deal with people, just in normal everyday circumstances, and our all our fruits of the Spirit that we should be filled with and displaying. All that should be evident. Even without somebody hearing us tell what the gospel is, they should be seeing it reflected in our lives. And the church as well, as a group, as a family of God, we should be doing that collectively. And he talks a lot about that and how we approach as a body. And we should be trying to influence society to be more of a reflection of the gospel of good news. So, we share it in all different kind of ways. And so what is the good news as it relates to the exile? One thing I want to look at is 1 Corinthians 15 before we turn back over to the Old Testament. But Paul, when he's talking about the gospel and where to start, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, and which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved." This good news, this gospel is key. It's what they're standing on. He said, "In which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures." The key point I want to emphasize from that passage there is that what Paul is saying is it's all centered around Christ, absolutely. But you don't just start with Christ's birth in Bethlehem. That's not the beginning of the gospel. The gospel doesn't start there in Bethlehem. And it doesn't start on the cross. What he's saying here is that all this was according to God's plan and in accordance with the Scriptures. And when he says the Scriptures, he's of course referring to, at that time, the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, the history. All of that was part of God's plan. And if you really want to understand what the gospel is, what it means, you can't just start in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, or John. No matter how beautiful the beginning of John, if that's all you're starting with, you're not really understanding what the gospel is and what God's mission is for his people. and what our mission should be. We've got to go back to the Old Testament, the Scriptures, to really put it in context. And that's what we've been trying to do here in this study. And tonight, so we're going to be doing that and going back to the exile. So let me talk about go look over in 2 Kings, just to sort of give you an idea of what was happening. Okay, 2 Kings 24. There were multiple, like I said, times when Judah faced destruction. Of course, what we're talking about now is God's people have left. We talked about Exodus last week. They've come into the Promised Land. They've driven out some of the tribes that were there and people there, but they didn't do everything that God had commanded them. They've been there, and after King David kind of reached, and King Solomon reached sort of the height pinnacle of the glory of ancient Israel, the kingdom divided, and between Judah around Jerusalem and the northern kingdom Israel. By this point here, we're reading out in 2 Kings chapter 24, Israel has already been, the 10 tribes of Israel that have already been carried off into captivity, they're not going to return. I mean, they're basically gone. It's only going to be the people of Judah that are going to actually get to come back, the return from exile. And so that's where we're at here is after Israel was carried off, sometime later Nebuchadnezzar came in. And what's going on here is that there's sort of a tug of war going on between Egypt and Assyria, and then Babylon that took over Assyria, Assyrians, and Judah has kind of come caught in the middle of that. But but God is working His destruction through all those events. So you see in 2 Kings chapter 24, this first time, at the time the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself and his mothers and his servants and his officials and his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign, and carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord. Think about how devastating that would have been to the people of Judah to see their temple desecrated like that, and the treasures carted off. And it says, which Solomon the king of Israel had made, as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives. 10,000 people were carted off, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. That was kind of their technique, was to go in and take the leaders and the skilled people and everything, and then all the people that they deemed more of a drag on their economy and would require support, they left behind. So they only took the able-bodied people that had some skill, and they took them all off, or the ones that were leaders that might cause them trouble if left behind. They took all of them off and left all these people behind. And then they put in a new king. Zedekiah. Of course, he wasn't much better than Jehoiachin, and we see in verse 20, the last part of verse 20, it says, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So apparently he didn't learn his lesson, and he rebelled. And so Nebuchadnezzar then says, okay, this is it. I've had it with these Jews, people of Judah. We're going back. And we see that starting there in chapter 25. And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army and against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works. Let's see, let me skip ahead. The king fled, verse 5, but the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his armies were scattered from him. Then they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and they passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains and took him to Babylon. I'm sure what the point of that was. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to leave this blind king now as the representative of the people of Israel, of Judah. And but the last thing he saw before they blinded him was his sons being killed. So it was a horrible situation there. And it says, it goes on in verse 9, and he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. And he goes on, you can read on there that he carted them off. And again, they left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. So your basic common laborers were left behind again. So here you can see what they did is, this part right here is the northern kingdom, the red one that I already talked about, where they were taken away to Nineveh and other parts in Assyria. Then later on, Babylonia, where the heart of it is the city of Babylon, rose up. It was actually kind of a province of Assyria, and then it rose up and basically replaced it. And that's where Nebuchadnezzar was, and he came over on at least 2 occasions and destroyed Jerusalem. He carried them off into Babylon. So think about that for a minute, that, like I said, how devastating that would be. And how bad, after this happened, it's roughly, we think, about 70 years that they spent in captivity there in Babylon. They were assimilated. They were put pressure on no longer to worship as the Babylonians did. Their culture, everything, their homes, their families, they all had been displaced and destroyed. And how devastating that would be. And most of all, how devastating it would be to see the temple where God's presence was. That's God. When they looked at the temple, they saw God, and God's presence was there. Now it was destroyed. So as they are carted off into captivity, into that uncertain future, God also departed. Which is a question I had as I was looking at this. It's like, well, where was God's presence during the exile? There was no temple. The ark had been destroyed or carried off. I guess it depends on whether you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, whether it was buried in the sand or something. But I think it was probably just destroyed throughout all this things that were going on. But God's presence was gone. Have you ever felt like that? Ever felt in your life where God felt distant, and maybe because of your own sins and your things that you have done, you feel like you've turned your back on God and God has left you? That must have been what was going through their minds. He hasn't, but it certainly can feel like that sometimes. I just think as they were going away from Jerusalem and they look back and see the temple destroyed, and where is God now? He's gone. How just crushing that would have been. A low, low point for God's people, what we're talking about here. So they were in desperate need of good news. Well, eventually, new rulers allow, let me go back, them to return. And they came back in a couple of waves. We know about Ezra and Nehemiah, where they came back to Jerusalem. They didn't, the first return, they didn't really do everything they were supposed to, and there was, they just didn't feel right to him, and then they came back again and made another go about it and tried to rebuild the temple. It's all a difficult time because they're still wondering, where is God? Where is God? But just think if you were one of those people left behind, or you're a child that's grown up in that situation while they're all exiled, and you're there in Jerusalem, and that devastation, or around in there, eking out a living. God is gone. All the people of Judah are gone except for the remnant there in Jerusalem. They actually brought in some other people, Gentiles, into that land to populate it too. So, the people there may have felt like they're about to be just sort of wiped out. But I think they probably often look to the east, to Babylon, hoping that God would bring them back, that things would be restored, that they would be redeemed. They were hoping for that, yearning for that return. That must have been a deep longing for the people there in Jerusalem. And that is exactly what Isaiah, where we're going to spend most of our time tonight, is dealing with in these chapters. Because Isaiah prophesies about that. Some of my favorite verses are actually in this section. My favorite verse of the Bible is actually in here. Y'all know which one that is? It's verse 40, verse 31. But anyway, let's look at what he says. Because when we talk about the good news and the gospel, that was not a new concept, a new word to the people of Israel, to the Jews in Jerusalem. When they started hearing that in Acts about the gospel and the spreading of the gospel, they were already very familiar with what good news was because they knew Isaiah. Isaiah talks about that using the same word, Hebrew word and Greek word. I'm not going to try to pronounce it up there, but the Hebrew word that's translated and the Greek word then for the translation of the Old Testament there. But that's the same word that Isaiah was using here. And look what he says in verse 49. 40 verse 9. And again, he's talking to these people during the exile and what to expect. He says, "Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news." There's the good news we're talking about. "Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good news, lift it up. Fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God." Isaiah has not given up, and he's trying to give them hope, trying to give them encouragement. And he's using the idea of good news. Lift your head up. Look and see. Be a herald of good news. Fear not. Because what? There at the end of verse 9. Behold your God. God was going to demonstrate his faithfulness to them. Going on to verse 41 and verse 27. Isaiah says, or the prophets here in this section of Isaiah says, "I was the first to say to Zion, behold, here they are. And I give to Jerusalem a herald of good news." Again, the same word that's going to be used to represent the gospel, the good news of Jesus. Isaiah is using it here to show that Jerusalem cannot abandon hope. God is still with them. They feel like God has left them, but he's still with them. When you feel like God has abandoned you, for whatever reason, your own sins, or just the world is crashing around you, or bad things have happened, and it feels like God is so distant, He has not left you. He has not left you. We have to keep that in mind and not abandon hope. That's going to be key to us understanding the mission of us. What's that? I said, God has not left you. Keep that. You cannot be we're talking about the mission of God's people. What is our mission here? If we're not convinced of that God has not left us, that He is there for us now and forever, for all eternity, we cannot be good messengers of the gospel. We cannot be about God's mission for us if we're not convinced of that. We have to. I hope that's one thing that we take away from here tonight, is that no matter how dark it seems, like it was for the people of Israel when they were in exile, or people of Judah, God does not abandon us. He didn't abandon them. He's not going to abandon us. He's working out His plan. I'm going to skip 52:7 because we're going to look at that in more depth in just a second. But let's go to 61, verse 1. It's about the year of the Lord's favor. The Spirit of the Lord of God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. Again, gospel, good news. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound. Isaiah here is trying to bring hope to them and spreading good news. And notice he's talking about who is this going to be encouraging to? It's good news to the poor. People of Israel, or the people of Judah there, were poor, eking out a living, as I said. They'd already had the most skilled laborers and leaders taken away. And the people in exile now were, even if they were prospering, somebody like Daniel or somebody in that situation might have been in good circumstances, but they're still not free. And they were not couldn't control their own fates. So in some sense they were poor, even if they were rich over there in Babylon. But certainly the people around Jerusalem were poor, in need of good news. And God is always concerned for the people who were oppressed, poor, outcast. That is a common theme in all of Isaiah, is justice for those who are downtrodden and oppressed. That is a heart and soul of the gospel. So, now we turn back over to that one passage, 52, verse 7, which is really the heart of where we want to look at the rest of the evening. By the way, Isaiah 40, I know we're looking at 52, but Isaiah 40 is such a wonderful chapter of encouragement. Because I'll go ahead and read because I think, again, this is imagine this being spoken to the people there in Jerusalem during the exile as they wandered about the ruins. He says to them, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Wait for the Lord. Not just sitting back, but an anticipation that the Lord is going to fulfill His promise to us. And He's going to renew their strength. They need a renewal. And they're going to mount up with wings like eagles. I love that verse. But that's the context of that particular verse. But let's go back over to 52. 1 through 7. So yeah, I kind of put this picture here. Imagine this is the ruins. Imagine this is the ruins around Jerusalem. That's probably about how it looked when the temple was destroyed and the walls were torn down. And looking off in the distance, if you were a watchman, and suddenly you see a single messenger coming. What is this person from the east bringing? What tidings? And the tidings is that God's people are coming home. God's people are coming home from captivity. They're coming back to rebuild. That's what 52 is talking about. Starting verse 7, actually. He says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchman." So I talk about, imagine being a watchman up there on these pile of rocks. "The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy, for eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem." And Jerusalem there is not just the city, but he's talking about all of God's people. Jerusalem is sort of how we say Washington when we're talking about all of America. Jerusalem there is not just the city itself, but he's talking about God's people. "The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God." Verse 11. "Depart, depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of her, purify yourselves, you who bear the vessels of the Lord." So, putting in that context of the exile and return from exile, you can see how this good news plays so well into our good news and that we see with Jesus in the gospel that Paul was talking about. When he's talking about in accordance with the Scripture, the gospel, he's talking about it, for instance, in accordance with this. When according to this good news, it's the same God's faithfulness again demonstrated. So, in what ways? In what ways? You can't just say good news. How is this good news, them coming back? Well, he says in verse 7, "Who publishes peace." Now, peace is a very important concept to people of Israel, because peace is not just the absence of conflict, right? Well, a lot of times we think about that. For instance, if you're in North Korea, South Korea, you're at the border there, there's no conflict, there's no active conflict, but would you say there's peace on the Korean Peninsula? Not at all. I mean, they are armed to the teeth, staring at one another across that border. They have placed mines everywhere. They have their artillery locked and loaded on each other all the time. I've talked to some soldiers that have come back from stationed over there, and it's talking about being uptight. The people are uptight over there that work in that area, because there's no conflict, active conflict, but there's not peace. Peace is not just the absence of conflict. It's a putting things right. It's a being in a right relationship, not just with God, but with each other, in our relationships, in our families, and not just withholding violence, but it's being, like I said, being in the right, I don't know if I'm explaining it very well, being in the right relationship with each other and with God. That is the peace that Isaiah here has in mind, that the prophet here has in mind, and what the people would understand. Shalom. Shalom, that's their idea, their word for peace. It's far more than, I hope nobody breaks your arm. It's far more than that. It's about being at peace with God and with each other. And that's what part of this good news is that all this conflict that Israel or Judah has experienced, now God is bringing peace to them. And he says, let's see, go on. "Who publishes peace, who brings good news or good tidings of happiness." So it's goodness. Goodness being brought back. These are all important concepts. Peace, goodness is part of this. Well, what do we mean when we say goodness? I like to think back, one reason we started in Genesis. What was when God created the world and placed Adam and Eve in the garden, and how did he view it? It was good. That is goodness. That is what's good. So, the way God saw that is goodness. And that is he's being promised here. Goodness. Not just people doing good things, but goodness in the world. Who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation is the third concept. Peace, goodness, salvation. So salvation is deliverance from destruction. And that is also what is being brought. The people of Judah were going to survive. They survive to this day, actually, the descendants of Abraham. Even in a physical sense and in a spiritual sense, but that's a whole another study. But nevertheless, the descendants of Abraham survived as a race. They were saved. They weren't thrown into the dustbin of history at this point. They were saved. Salvation was brought. And what does all that boil into? God reigns. When we say God reigns, here in verse 7, that's what he's talking about. Peace, goodness, salvation. That is what it means when we say God reigns. If God reigns in his kingdom, that's what's inside that kingdom. That's what's happening in that kingdom. People are in right relationship with each other, with God. There's goodness. God looks down upon it and it is good. His kingdom is good. There is no evil. And everybody is saved from destruction. There's salvation. That's all part of what it means that God's reign is being proclaimed there in verse 7. So, also, moving on then, what else we find in this passage? We see that God is returning. He's not just reigning, he's returning. Remember how I said God had left and departed? How that would have been so devastating. Look what he says in verse 8. The voice of your watchmen, together they sing for joy, for eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Where did he go? I don't know, during the exile. He wasn't at the temple because the temple was destroyed. But here we see the prophet saying, part of this good news is the reign of God, and now it's the return of the Lord to Zion. So it's his return. Now, he made a point here in this study I thought was interesting. He notes that there's really 3 returns of God that we see in the Bible. Okay, if you want. All right, so what are the returns that he mentioned? I mean, there are probably different ways of looking at that and saying that. When we talk about the return of God, I'll give you a hint. This is number 1. All right, and this is number 1. The return of God from exile. God returns from exile. Where else do we see God returning to Jerusalem? We're about to observe it. Well, some people are about to observe it. We don't really do that here in a few weeks. Palm Sunday, right? Palm Sunday, we know that Jesus entered in a very deliberate way into Jerusalem. He makes this point in this day. I thought it was good. I mean, Jesus had been walking all over Judah, and from Galilee. My goodness, he probably would have walked the socks off all of us easily because he could walk, and his disciples walked everywhere. But he chose at the time to go into Jerusalem not to walk. There was a very deliberate choice. He came in on the donkey. And everybody knew. Why did they react the way they did? Everybody knew what that meant. God returned. God is returning. Just as he had done after the exile. God is returning. That's the second one that he talks about. And then what's the third? What would be the third? It hadn't happened yet. Second coming. When he comes again, that will be the third. The three return. You can see how the gospel, it flows from the Old Testament to the New Testament to our expectation in the future. That's all part of the gospel. God is returning. So that's also part of this Isaiah's message to them and how we see the gospel and its prophecy. And then God redeems. That's another part of it. Verse 9 and 10. Break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to this tonight about the holy arm, the significance of that. But he's done it by bearing his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. The key verse there is that God has redeemed Jerusalem. So the key concept there is redeems. I might have missed this on a Wednesday night. Did y'all talk about redemption as far as the concept of redemption in Israel's daily life and how they believed in that? There's a big issue about redemption. That's one reason they had that year of Jubilee, the 50th year, when all debts were forgiven. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? All debts were forgiven. Yes. But it all fit into this idea of redemption in that the family life, the family, the clan, your tribe, that was all very important in ancient Israel. And what the key concept of that was if somebody in your family was down on their luck, they may live nearby and their crops failed, or they fell and broke their leg and couldn't farm for a season, or whatever misfortune fell them, it caused them to go into a lower state, go into debt, or not be able to feed themselves or whatever. It was incumbent upon the family and the clan to help that person out. And if they had gone into debt to the point where they were in servitude, it was an obligation on you to redeem them from that servitude, from slavery or whatever, the misfortune they were in. We don't always have that concept nowadays for a variety of reasons, but that was so important for the people of Israel, is that somebody you knew, somebody part of your tribe, your clan, your people got into trouble, you would redeem them. You would do whatever you can to take them out of slavery, to bring them up, take them out of debt, redeem their debt, and get back on their feet. So look at Exodus chapter 6. We can see a little bit about this. Because here, he's going to be talking about the redemption of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. Again, we're talking about the arm of God redeeming them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your people, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for possession. I am the Lord. That's what redemption was. They had lost their land. They had been taken from it. They had gone down and were enslaved in Egypt, and God was redeeming them and restoring them to their promised land. That's what the Exodus story is all about. And that's what he's promising here, the prophet in Isaiah, when he says, with his exile, the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. Just as he did before in Exodus, he is redeeming Jerusalem, his people, and by bringing them back from exile. So that's might be a good. I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about his holy arm. Well, Tommy, next week am I still up for teaching this, or where are we on our schedule? Do you?
I think last week Greg said you had 2 weeks.
Yeah, so I can still finish.
Oh yeah.
Okay. All right. It doesn't look like I'm going to get through my next 6 pages of notes. So I apologize for that. We'll pick up with the Holy Arm. That's a good place to start. I just picked this Sistine Chapel thing. You know, I cut it off, but you know who's on the other side there is depicted that God is reaching out. Does anybody know? Adam. Yeah. Adam is reaching out, and God is reaching out. It's supposed to show the moment of creation when God is reaching out and putting life into him. But anyway, I thought it was a good depiction of what God's holy arm and all the significance of that. Isaiah talks about that over and over and over again. God bearing his arm and his holy arm and how it redeems and the different ways that he does that. So we'll pick up there, but at any rate, what we're going to do next week then, we're going to take these themes we've seen in Isaiah chapter 52 of God reigning, his returning, and his redemption, how that's seen in this time period in Israel, and then we're going to see how it applies to the gospel as shown in the New Testament, of course, with Jesus, how Jesus represents that, what that means. So that's what we'll do next week, and we'll stop there. Does anybody have? I went on and on. Does anybody have any comments? Yes. Yes.
In the vision, by the Spirit of God, into Chaldea to the exiles. It's like God left, because Jerusalem's gone, and where did he go? He went with them. And it's like, I don't know that they didn't see him physically like in the tabernacle or the cloud. You know, they didn't, he was with them. He
Right.
went with them. And I was like, once I was like, that's just like the coolest thing ever. Because even when you can't see or whatever, still, it's just cool that he went with them.
That's a good point. I had that verse somewhere, but I guess I left it out of my
It's Ezekiel, right?
Yeah.
Ezekiel 11:22 through 25.
Yeah.
It's pretty evident, the first 3 chapters of Daniel, that God's with them.
God is with, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't think I ever realized that before.
They just could worship him and enter his presence like they had in Jerusalem. But he was there.
Yeah,
He was there.
yeah.
Very important to remember for us too. Okay. Any other thoughts? Thank you. Bobby Lynn. All right. You all be safe going home in this cold, wet weather.